Hi, my name is Jim McIntosh and I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Clark County School District. The Advisory Committee for Assembly Bill 394, which is the reorganization of the Clark County School District, had requested the Clark County School District provide a presentation on the equity of funding distribution within the Clark County School District. Part of the presentation requires us to define for the committee what is equity. And one of the things that we have to make very clear when we talk about equity within a school district is we are not talking about adequacy. Adequacy is how much money it takes to run or fully fund a school district. What we're talking about here is equity. How do we properly distribute funds in order that those students who require additional funds receive what they need? So there are two types of equity that we deal with in the Clark County School District or any school district. There's horizontal equity, and that's treating similar students similarly or providing similar funding for similar students. And there's vertical equity, or providing dissimilar students with dissimilar funding. These graphics show some hypothetical examples of classrooms and the funding provided to the students within each classroom. Let's talk about horizontal equity first. Horizontal equity could be ensuring that your school district provides a similar amount of funds for a similar group of people, and that could be a broad group of students, such as we ensure that all first graders at elementary schools receive the same amount of funding, or we ensure that all students in career and technical programs receive the same amount of funding. Now let's talk about vertical equity. Vertical equity is ensuring that dissimilar students receive dissimilar funding. And what do we mean by that? Well, there are certain students in the Clark County School District that require more resources in order for us to get them to these common educational outcomes. Those outcomes are things such as math, science, reading proficiency, graduation, all of the things that we'd like for our students to achieve in the school year. Certain students will require additional resources, though, to get there. And we want to ensure that they are provided those resources. So I want to make one distinction here. Equity is not equality. Equality is treating everybody exactly the same. Equity is ensuring dissimilar students get exactly what they need. So when a student is a special education student, when a student's first language is not English, when a student comes from an at-risk background, these students we've found, studies have found, that require additional resources in order to educate. And we need to ensure that the funding distribution model within the Clark County School District addresses those needs and that those students receive the additional funding that they need in order to reach those common educational outcomes. If we take horizontal equity and we take vertical equity and we combine the two together, what are we looking for? Equity in the school district equals educational opportunity for all of our students and providing for those common educational outcomes for every one of the students in the Clark County School District. Equity is providing students what they need and not just access to equal funding. So how does the Clark County School District go about doing this? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to separate the different streams of revenue that the Clark County School District receives. One of the largest that it receives is from the state through the Nevada Plan. The Nevada Plan is a funding formula that was created in 1967 to appropriately fund school districts across the state of Nevada. The money that the district receives from the Nevada Plan and some additional revenues that it receives outside of this plan generally go into what's known as the general fund of the Clark County School District. This is the largest fund in the Clark County School District, and it, for the most part, is the funding used to appropriate for the day-to-day operations of running a school district, paying teacher salaries, paying for instructional materials, paying for utilities. Those funds are what we call non-categorical, meaning we have to use the funds for the mission of the Clark County School District, but the Clark County School District has a lot of discretion in how those funds are spent. Outside of the general fund, the district also receives supplementary funds, either from the state or the federal government. Those funds are for programs such as class size reduction, special education. Federal programs provide money, or what we call categorical funds, for students at risk, which are known as Title I funds, and for special education funds, also known as an IDEA grant. Certain state grants we receive include funding for full-day kindergarten, our Zoom schools, which are our special schools that we use to teach our students where English is not their first language. We also have victory schools to address the needs of our at-risk students or students who come from a background of poverty. In addition to that, the school district also receives funds for a program known as Read by 3, and that's Read by Grade 3. And it's a program that the state recently instituted in the last legislative session in order to ensure that our students are reading and are literate by Grade 3. With all of these programs, we have to understand exactly how the funding is distributed within the Clark County School District. In the general fund, the largest fund of the district, the funding we generally receive through the distributive school account and the Nevada plan, those funding formulas are based off of what we call staff or student-based funding formulas. So revenues aren't driven directly to a school. Staffing models are driven to a school. Schools require a certain level of staffing in order to operate. There are a certain number of core teachers that are required to be at those schools teaching core subjects to operate the school. And so what we do is in the general fund is we provide a staffing model to a school, not revenues per se, but a staffing model, and we allow for what we call full-time equivalent employees to be hired by the school. That's different when it comes to state grants and federal grants. Many times state grants and federal grants are appropriated to a school through a revenue process that is based off of a key metric or some proprietary formula based on need or some other criteria. For example, our Title I funds that we receive from the federal government are generally distributed to schools based off of the percentage of students that qualify for a free or reduced lunch. Our IDEA funds from the federal government are generally based off of the type of disability that the student has. When it comes to state grants, there are proprietary formulas for Victory schools, for Zoom schools, and for our Read by 3 programs. Studies have shown that funding allocations to schools within a single school district may have a greater impact on student than funding across school districts. And this is why the concept of equitable distributions of funds is so important. So one of the ways that we're able to measure an equitable distribution of funds is to review the per pupil statistics of the Clark County School District. The per pupil expenditures are reported annually by the Clark County School District to the state of Nevada, and they provide a lot of insight as to how we're spending money on a per pupil basis in each one of our schools. And so the district average per pupil, and all of this information comes from fiscal year 2014, but the district average per pupil is approximately $8,337. That varies by the level of the school. So elementaries, middles, and high schools all have an average that's very different. Elementaries receive approximately $8,618 per pupil on average, middle schools $6,677, and high schools $6,600. But there's a wide variation of range in all of the schools within the Clark County School District as to what we're spending on a per pupil or per unit basis, which helps us and the finance office go in and review and make sure that we're equitably distributing funds. What makes a school cost more? In many cases, it has to do with the students within that school. Some of our schools that are our most costly schools include schools that are in rural areas, some of our behavioral schools, simply because the student population is so low or there are additional needs at those areas. The highest per pupil cost in the Clark County School District is approximately $59,477. That is related to one of our behavioral schools where the school does not start with an actual enrolled population, but students are referred to the schools. One of the lowest per pupil costs is $4,509. So what affects per pupil costs? And there are several things that can affect per pupil costs. Probably the two largest have to do with the enrollment, the school size, the number of students at the school, and the teacher cost. In addition to that, you're going to see special programs, strategic initiatives, and central office resources that are ultimately allocated or appropriated to schools affect the per pupil cost of the school. But the two in the Clark County School District, these two metrics that are probably the most important are school size and teacher cost. The higher the cost of a teacher, the higher you're going to have per pupil cost. The more students you have at a school, the more you're going to drive down per pupil costs. In many cases, this is simply because there are several fixed costs at a school, and the more students that you have at the school, you're able to drive down the cost on a per unit basis. So let's compare two schools at the Clark County School District. We have Elementary School A, which is a one-star school, but it also has programs for Zoom schools. It has a Title I program and a flexible budget. We have Elementary School B, which is a five-star school, and it has a flex budget. And so the enrollment in Elementary School A is approximately 599 students, while the enrollment in Elementary School B is approximately 878 students. On an annual basis, they seem to receive a similar amount of expenditures. So Elementary School A receives approximately $4.5 million in annual costs. Elementary School B receives approximately $4.7 million in annual costs. But if we look at that on a per pupil basis, something very interesting happens. The per pupil cost of elementary school A is $7,656, while the per pupil cost of elementary school B is $5,383. Why are more dollars directed to elementary school A? That's due to the demographics if you take a look down here at the bottom. There are a significant higher number of English language learner students at elementary school A, 369 compared to 61 at elementary school B. There's a significant amount of free and reduced lunch eligible students, 599 compared to 161. And there's a significant number of special education students at elementary school A, 91 as compared to 64. Studies have shown that these students will require more resources to get to those common educational outcomes, such as graduation and math, science, and reading proficiency that we look for at the Clark County School District. So here's an example of a school where we are allocating additional resources, and much of it through state and federal support, to help support those students at these schools achieve those educational outcomes. Here's the comparison of the two schools, looking at the direct cost of those schools, just broken down by various components so you can get a sense of how those dollars are actually distributed at those schools. And then again, a further comparison of how elementary school A and elementary school B have a breakdown in the amount of staff that are provided at those schools. And so you can see in elementary school A, there's a component for federal grants and state grants that elementary school B is not receiving. So we believe that this is an equitable distribution of funds. This school is receiving additional funding and additional staffing on a per pupil basis in order to accommodate those special needs students at those schools. So let's take a look at a hypothetical example at two different schools, and this example is simply hypothetical and for illustrative purposes. Let's assume we have a school where there's only 30 students in each school. We have a 30-to-1 class size ratio, so we hire one teacher at each school. Let's start with the non-Title I school on the right. This school is able to hire a teacher, and they pay $60,000 for that teacher. There are 30 students in that school, and so when you divide the number of students by 60,000, on a per pupil basis, the cost of that teacher is $2,000. If we look over at the Title I school, perhaps they're unable to actually fill their teaching position. And so that ends up only costing the school $30,000 on an annual basis to fill that teaching position. You divide that $30,000 by the same number of students, 30. On a per pupil basis, that school is only costing that district $1,000 per pupil. And so the important point to note here is that many times we have well-intentioned policies to provide for staffing. The dollars don't necessarily follow the students. This school is a Title I school, which would require additional supports, but they're not necessarily receiving them in terms of dollars. And so we want to make sure that there's a way going forward that we can equitably distribute teachers across the district so that we have qualified teachers in all of our schools. Here's an example of elementary staffing ratios. Again, just to comment that the revenues are not provided necessarily to schools. There's no process for allocating revenues to schools. There's a process for allocating staffing to school. And here's the process for allocating a staffing model to schools. Schools are then allowed to go out through their administration to go hire these teachers, and the teacher costs could range depending on the type of teacher they get in the classroom, the seniority, the education level of the teacher. If they're unable to hire a teacher, in many cases they have to fill that teacher with a vacancy, which will be a much less cost for that school. So let's take a look now at some of the statistics in the Clark County School District and which schools are on the range of on per pupil expenditures. So the district average per pupil cost is $8,337. So I had mentioned earlier that some of our most costly schools on a per pupil basis are our rural schools. And so here's just a table listing all of the rural schools and their jurisdictions for the Clark County School District. And as you can see, many of these schools are at the higher end of the range or greater than the district average per pupil cost. Why is that? In many cases, rural schools are lower enrolled. They have additional costs associated with providing services to these outlying areas. And so that can increase their impact, the per pupil expenditure. I also mentioned our behavioral and continuation school costs per pupil. Sometimes these are our most costly schools on a per pupil basis. And the reality here is that there are certain fixed costs that are required to run a school. These schools are fully staffed at the beginning of the year in order to provide for the core subjects that need to be taught at these schools. Students are ultimately referred to these schools, and depending on the number that are referred there, these costs can vary greatly. But these, again, are some of the highest per pupil costs in the Clark County School District. Here are some statistics across the district just to give you a sense of the need to provide for an equitable distribution of funds in the Clark County School District. There's some information here regarding our English language learners or our ELL students, our free and reduced lunch students or our FRL students, and students that require special education services. Those students are identified by having an individual education plan, and it's also known as an IEP. This is an 11-year chart, and you can go back and take a look at the total enrollment of the district in the second column here, and you can get a sense at how large these populations have grown over time. Each of these populations, the district knows, will require additional resources in order to educate, and so we need to equitably distribute funds within the district. And just as a reminder, equitable does not mean equal. It doesn't mean providing each of these schools with the same amount of money per pupil. It means providing those students with need the additional amounts they need in order to reach those educational outcomes. Here's some additional information for English language learner students, free and reduced lunch students, and special education students by ethnicity. And just additional demographic information to show you the volume of students that we have and their various ethnicities within the Clark County School District. Here's some information regarding a 3-year demographic of the Clark County School District. This information changes on a regular basis. And so now let's talk about the different types of schools and funding that the district receives in order to make that equitable distribution of funding. In the 2013 legislative session, the legislature provided additional funding for English language learner students. Those are our students in the Clark County School District whose primary language is not English. The legislature provided funding on a per pupil basis, approximately $1,854 for each one of those, for students who are involved in Zoom schools. Here are the various schools that have been identified as Zoom schools. The metric here was to find the schools with the highest population of English language learner students. Total Zoom school funding is approximately $39.3 million in the Clark County School District. In the 2015 legislative session, the legislature additionally provided funds for what we call victory schools. Victory schools are schools to help support our most at-risk students. Those are identified for those schools where we have the highest populations of students that are eligible for free and reduced lunches. Victory school funds come out to approximately $1,137 per pupil. Here are the schools listed here that are receiving victory school funds, and total victory school funding amounts to $19.7 million. The Clark County School District recognizes that there are certain students that require additional resources in order to get to common educational outcomes. And if we are equitably distributing funds, we need to ensure that we are providing additional funds for those students who need them. That is the definition of equity, providing support for those students who require the additional supports in order to get to those common educational outcomes. Some of those students include our English language learner students, students who come from a background of poverty, our special education students, gifted and talented students, and students in rural areas. The Clark County School District recognizes that sometimes these students require additional resources in order to get to those common educational outcomes. The analogy I like to use is that of a baseball diamond. Some students come into the school district on first base. Some students come into the school district already on third base. And let's assume it costs $1,000 to cross each one of these bases. The student on first base is going to require to go to second base, third base, and then home. $3,000 to get home. The student on third base is only going to require $1,000 to get home. And so we need to recognize that there are different needs and thus different funding requirements in order to provide that equity to get these students to the common educational outcomes. What are those common outcomes? Graduation, reading proficiency, math and science proficiency, and college and career readiness. We would like for all of the students within the Clark County School District to have these common outcomes, and we recognize that it's our goal to equitably distribute funding within the district in order for every student to achieve these outcomes. So how do we go about doing this? Right now, we've started analyzing and reviewing funding allocations within the Clark County School District. The superintendent has started an initiative known as Ensuring Every Dollar Counts that began reviewing return on investment of programs within the district to ensure that we're allocating funds appropriately and that we're receiving the biggest bang for our buck within these programs. We need to transition from formula or student or initiative-based allocations, as we talked about earlier. Instead of a staffing model where we provide schools with the model of how much they have to staff their schools, we'd like to give them more flexibility with how they use their funds, so they have more local decision-making or control over the funds that they're given from the Clark County School District. We need to move to program-based budgeting, where we determine which programs are being utilized at a school and whether they're providing us with a solid return on investment. We also need to take a direction from the state, who is going to begin providing for weighted student funding and recognizing that these student populations require additional funding and there isn't a one-size-fits-all dollar amount that you can provide. As the state begins to weight student funding for particular student needs, the district will allocate funds to the schools in a similar manner. We need to begin equitably distributing qualified teachers across the district. Some of our Title I schools have the largest amount of vacancies in the district and are unable to hire a qualified teacher in the classroom. When that happens, we have to bring in a long-term substitute to run the classroom. The district needs to come up with programs and ways and initiatives in order to equitably distribute those qualified teachers across the valley. One of the ways that we begun doing that is providing compensation incentives or signing bonuses for those teachers who are willing to teach at a Title I or at-risk school. So that concludes the presentation on equity. Thank you for your time. For more information, please go to the Clark County School District's website at www.ccsd.net or www.ccsd.net/open book. Thank you.